Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, esteemed colleagues and friends. Welcome to each of you, wherever you're joining us in the world. My name is Kate Oren, and I'm a Senior Gender Program Manager at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, Iucn. And on behalf of the team here, all of the partners and co-organizers for this session, thank you so much for your time and interest to join this session today. Please know that we have simultaneous translation for this session, English, Spanish, and French. So to listen to this webinar in your preferred language, please go ahead and download the application called Interactio from the Apple Store or Google Play Store. When you open it, you're going to need to enter the code GBV-ENV that you see on your screen. It's usually most convenient, we think, to listen to the translation through headphones or on a phone or another device, remembering to mute the sound on the computer or the screen that you're watching this webinar on so that you can hear the live translation clearly. The registration email you received is also going to have these instructions in it. And if you have any questions or challenges, just reach out to us via the chat box, which is probably on the right-hand side of your screen in the control panel. So next, just for a couple of seconds, we're going to show a quick demonstration of how to access this live translation. Thank you to the Interactio team. So we're all used to virtual sessions by now, but just a few important virtual housekeeping matters to bear in mind before we continue. So first, please do be aware that this session is being recorded and it will be available in all 3 languages on our website. Please note that we're keeping the microphones in mute mode, just simply to minimize connectivity distractions. However, we warmly encourage your active participation via the chat box. So please do share comments, observations, or questions for our speakers to factor into the discussion. If you have any questions or issues, again, connectivity concerns, please feel free to use that chat box in the control panel to reach out to the amazing team behind the scenes here. And finally, a very big thanks to this team behind the scenes, as well as our partners at USAID who make this session possible. And again, to all of the amazing collaborators for this particular session. Now, as you will already know from the title of this session, I would like to take a moment to remind us all that this session is going to discuss various forms, expressions, experiences of gender-based violence, which can be uncomfortable, upsetting, or triggering for some. So we invite you to please take care. Today's session is part of a webinar series from the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center, which is hosted by us at IUCN with support and in collaboration from USAID through our partnership called Agent, Advancing Gender in the Environment. The GBV ENV Center works to close the knowledge gap on GBV environment linkages while mobilizing learning, cooperation, and support to forge collaborative action towards ending GBV and securing a healthy and peaceful planet. This webinar series aims to build awareness, including by sharing our own research on linkages, as well as the new work of partners and peers, by learning about challenges, as well as strategies, tools, and promising practice across sectors, and by engaging and building a community to better understand and address gender-based violence and environment linkages. It's March 1st, ahead of International Women's Day next week. Today's session kicks off a very busy month of March focused at the gender-environment nexus. a period in which the Commission on the Status of Women, or CSW, will tackle the priority theme of advancing gender equality in the context of environmental degradation, climate change, and disaster risk reduction, for example, while parties to and stakeholders of the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, resume sessions toward finalizing the new global biodiversity framework, among other related policy setting processes, and while countries continue to implement their Paris Agreement commitments and more. So what do we know about existing, emerging, or needed policy frameworks, plans, and strategies that actually enable rights-based action to address GBV in relation to climate and biodiversity issues? Well, today our incredible lineup of speakers will engage this core question, sharing experiences, innovative solutions, and critical gaps for urgent action. To usher this discussion, it is my pleasure and honor to hand the floor over to my colleague, Ali Raza Rizvi, IUCN's climate change head. Now, Ali has been involved with the conservation and development sector for over 2 decades and has managed programs and projects worldwide. In his current position, Ali provides vision, strategic direction, and the operational guidance necessary for the development and implementation of IUCN's global work on climate change. My friend Ali, we're so lucky to have you today, so I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Kate, and the team. It's a pleasure to be here today, to be part of this such an important discussion. As we know, climate change, biodiversity, and gender, they're so integral. And as a right-based organization, and one that has understood for decades that gender inequality is a roadblock to meeting our conservation, sustainable development, and climate resilience goals, we understand that gender-based violence is, first and foremost, a violation of human rights and a barrier to a healthy and peaceful planet for all. And through our research with USAID, we understand that GBV can dramatically increase across resource-scarce contexts, as plentiful evidence across environmental sector shows. And these findings were documented in IUCN's flagship publication, Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages, the Violence of Inequality, and the basis of our joint action with the USAID and many other partners to tackle these issues. And the impacts of climate change and escalating biodiversity loss crises, create primary conditions, such a prime condition of urgency. For example, spiking reports of domestic violence in post-disaster context. We all know so many examples from all over the world. And increasing resilience on child marriage as a survival strategy in climate vulnerable regions. As the climate biodiversity emergency accelerates, we must recognize that gender-blind climate and environment-focused policies and implementation frameworks can unintentionally create conditions for heightened risk with differentiated impacts on those most commonly disenfranchised, including diverse women, girls, and sexual and gender minorities. On the other hand, though we can bridge these gaps, including by sharing knowledge, grasping the opportunities before us to work cooperatively across sectors, and that's what our aim is today. Today, we have with us leading voices in climate and environmental action, as well as gender equality leaders and experts in eliminating GBV, all to discuss the existing, emerging, and urgently needed policy frameworks and enabling conditions that are fundamental to facilitate collaborative right-based actions to address GBV and to combat climate change and biodiversity loss. Let me introduce our first speaker, who due to CSW negotiations has limited time this morning. I trust, Simi, you would be leaving around 9:30-ish. So Simi Kayyum is UN Women Policy Advisor on Sustainable Development with a focus on the articulation of sustainable livelihood, access to energy and resources, social and ecological resilience. She was a co-lead author of the first Global Gender and Environment Outlook, UNEP's flagship assessment, co-author of UN Women's Leveraging Co-Benefits between gender equality and climate action for sustainable development, and coordinated the production of the World Survey on the role of women in development, gender equality, and sustainable development. Also, we have with us Lucy Marankey, is the Vice President of the International Indigenous Women Forum, President of the Organization of African Indigenous Women in the East African region, and Executive Director of the Indigenous Information Network. She is a Maasai woman who began her activism as a television journalist on issues related to the environment and development. She is also the co-founder of the Biodiversity Network of Indigenous Women, and in recent years, she has coordinated the African region as a member of the International Forum on Biodiversity under the Convention on Biological Diversity. She is recipient of multiple environmental awards in recognition of her work with Indigenous people. Also, we have with us Gillian Cardwell, who serves as the Chief Climate Officer at USAID and is responsible for directing and overseeing climate and environment work across the agency. She also serves as a Deputy Assistant Administrator, overseeing DDI's Center for Environment, Energy and Infrastructure, and the Office of Environmental and Social Risk Management within the Bureau for Development, Democracy, and Innovation. Ms. Caldwell has worked to protect human rights and the environment throughout her career. Prior to joining USAID, she served as the CEO of Global Witness, and from 2007 and 10, she launched and led iSky, a highly collaborative cross-sector campaign with over 600 allied organizations to pass legislation in the US to address the climate crisis, among other academic and professional achievements. And from Mexico, we have Andrea Agno, who is the Biodiversity and Cooperation Strategies Coordinator at Mexico National Commission for the Knowledge and Use of Biodiversity. Dr. Cruz Iucn coordinated the upscaling process of Mexico's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, as well as Mexico's 5th and 6th National Report to the CBD. Part of the Mexican delegation, she negotiates in the open-ended working group that supports the presentation, dissemination, and review of the zero draft to be adopted by all signatory countries in the CBD post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework processes. And also we have with us Erin Kenny, who is the head of the technical unit and senior technical advisor at Spotlight Initiative, a global multi-year partnership between the European Union and the United Nations to eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls by 2030. Prior to joining the Spotlight Secretariat, Ms. Kenny was a gender-based violence team leader within UNFPA's Humanitarian and Fragile Contexts branch, and prior to that, she worked with the International Rescue Committee and Child Fund International to design and implement GBV and reproductive health programs in conflict and post-conflict settings. Unfortunately, Angela Nakafero, the Commissioner for Gender at the Ministry of Gender, Labor and Social Development of Uganda, cannot be here with us today, but we are very happy that we have Christine Ekakot, Uganda's Spotlight Initiative focal person, to represent her. So, we will go into discussion, and all these, some with these experts who are from representing so many different and diverse sectors. And I would request that our responses, if we are very concise for, 3 minutes around, so that we can have a good discussion around the topic. And to audience also, you can start sending your question to the speaker via the chat box, and they will be factored in the discussion. Please include to whom you are directing the questions. So let's start the discussion. Simi, with you. As a policy advisor on sustainable development with UN Women, you have unique insight into the importance of the priority theme this year for the annual meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, which is negotiating now the draft outcome document focused on advancing gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So can you talk a bit about CSW this year, what you anticipate may come out of the discussions? In particular, how may CSW discussions and outcome inform right-based, gender-responsive environmental decision-making? So over to you, Simin.
Thank you so much, Ali, and thank you so much, Kate. Can everyone hear me well?
Yes, please go.
Thank you so much. And my apologies in advance for having to leave this very important discussion early this morning. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak about the Commission on the Status of Women and its priority theme this year, which is a new and emerging issue for the Commission on the Status of Women. And as Kate and Ali have both mentioned, the priority theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programming. And this priority theme is critical for accelerating the full and effective implementation of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the gender responsive achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and meeting commitments and obligations under the Rio Conventions. And not least, it provides a huge challenge and a huge opportunity to build back better in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in thinking about the priority theme for the Commission on the Status of Women this year, what we have seen is that gender inequality coupled with climate and environment crises really are the greatest sustainable development challenges of our time. Climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters affect the entire planet and all peoples, but not in the same way or degree, while gender inequality denies human rights to half of humanity. We'd like to emphasize that these interlinked crises threaten the full realization of human rights, and in particular, the rights to life and dignity, development, a life free from violence and discrimination, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, rights to water and sanitation, and the right to a healthy environment, and others, and these all have acute impacts on women and girls, particularly in rural, remote, indigenous, and migrant contexts. I'd like to put a spotlight on the recent UN Human Rights Council landmark resolution that recognizes the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment and encourages states to adopt policies for the enjoyment of this right, including with respect to biodiversity and ecosystems, and bearing in mind that other human rights obligations, including gender equality, must be respected. So in our discussions so far on the priority theme, we've seen that there are a number of interlinked areas that merit consideration and that will be considered in the negotiations of the agreed conclusions, which are the outcome of the Commission on Status of Women every year, and which are implemented by member states. These agreed conclusions are also used very importantly by a number of other stakeholders besides government, including civil society, including feminist movements, including gender equality advocates, to advocate for increased gender equality, increased attention to women's rights, and the empowerment and of all women and girls. So these, in a nutshell, not to take up too much time, are integrating gender perspectives into climate, environment, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, promoting women's and girls' full and equal participation and leadership in climate, environment, and disaster risk action and governance at all levels, strengthening the capacities of women and girls in their organizations to build climate, environmental, and disaster resilience, ensuring sexual and reproductive health and rights in climate and environmental crises and disasters, strengthening prevention, response, and recovery from sexual and gender-based violence in climate and environmental crises and disasters, increasing gender-responsive climate, environmental, and disaster risks finance, and finally, the penultimate one is improving gender statistics and sex disaggregated data in the gender environment nexus and supporting and financing gender responsive just transitions. I'll stop there in the interest of time, but I would like to point out how important it has been to be able to draw upon, rely upon, and get inspiration from the work that our colleagues and friends at Iucn, supported by USAID, have been doing in recent years in the gender and environment nexus. And these studies and reports and analysis are referenced and bolster and are cited in the Secretary General's report on the priority theme that underpins member state negotiations of the agreed conclusions in this year's Commission on the Status of Women. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Simi. Could I request other panelists also to switch on their cameras, please, so that the panel is there. As Simi, you would be going back to the negotiations, and good luck with the whole process. But just another a related question. We all know that UN Women works extensively on the elimination of violence against women and girls in all their diversity, which is a pervasive and persistent barrier to realizing gender equality. How will CSW's priority theme consider these linkages?
Thank you very much for that question, and I'll be very brief. This issue is incredibly important in terms of considering the priority theme for this year's Commission on the Status of Women. And as I've mentioned, strengthening the prevention, response, and recovery from sexual and gender-based violence in climate and environmental crises and disasters is a key message that underpins all of our work and advocacy around CSW this year. And as we have seen, the shadow pandemic of violence against women and girls during COVID-19 exemplifies the surge of sexual and gender-based violence that occurs in crises and disasters. And women and girls facing multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination are particularly at risk. The increase in femicides, threats, and violence against women environmental human rights defenders is of particular concern. And these women human rights defenders, I'd like to put the spotlight particularly on Indigenous women. The violence against them, the increases in recent years, is truly alarming. In 2020, and I'm sure that these are undercounts, but at least 331 environmental defenders were killed, including 44 women, 69% of them defending land, Indigenous peoples, and environmental rights, and 28% women's rights. So in this context, the provision of essential services for prevention, response, and recovery from sexual and gender-based violence is critical, particularly in contexts of climate and environment crises and disasters. And we also need to pay attention and promote and protect the rights of women environmental human rights defenders and ensure that violations and abuses against them are investigated and those responsible held accountable. Thank you, Ali.
Thank you, Simi. and good luck with the whole process. It's such a challenging area to have these interlinkages and keep promoting through different, global policies and processes. So thank you for working on these areas, and we look forward working with you in future also. Okay, now I'll move to Lucy Molenkai, who has been, again facing so many challenges, and especially working in Africa, where there are other also associated challenges like poverty and degradation of environment and other. So, Lucy, thank you so much for joining this discussion today. Let's hear from you. What are some of the pressing gender-based violence and environment linkages you see, and how must gender equality and environmental policy frameworks step up enabling conditions to address them, particularly to protect the rights, safety, and dignity of all people, especially including women, environmental human rights defenders? So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be here. I hope I'm audible enough. Though today I'm speaking while in Rwanda, in Kigali, discussing issues of environment and also talking about disasters and so on. And your question is very important, because what the lady Iucn from UN Women has just spoken about and given the example of Indigenous women is very clear that we've been having quite a lot of challenges. And this is because mainly the issue of the rights and recognition of Indigenous peoples, not only in Africa, but also in Asia and globally, has been such a big challenge. And it looks like Indigenous people all the time we have to struggle. When others climb the hill in an easier way, we have to go the rough way. Because first we have these traditions that exist within us, and also the fact that already Indigenous people are marginalized becomes more and more critical. The other issue is that where the Indigenous women live and the rural women is remote areas where they don't get the information, they don't get access to legal redress, they don't get enough information to be able to really look at different issues that they can be able to tackle. And when you look at issues of gender-based violence, they come in different ways. I think she's mentioned some of the issues that she has already mentioned, but if you look at some of the issues, they also come because of issues of land and traditions, and also because some of the issues that happen during the time of disaster. Indigenous women are always the victims, the Indigenous women and girls. When we have drought, when we have any disaster, conflict within the areas, it's only the Indigenous women who are actually carry the biggest burden. So that adds to more of the challenges that really encounter the women. And for Indigenous women, we also don't want all the time to complain on the different challenges that we get, but we've been working together to see how we can have the governments recognize the rights of the Indigenous peoples and also Indigenous women, how we can work with partners, and how we can continue to make sure that our issues are right on the table. And the 2021 was quite a very intensive year for us, because as Indigenous women, we were able to have our conference and be able to really discuss globally on different issues. And we came up with a declaration, which we shared with quite a number of partners. And we also pushed forward to be able to have a recommendation with the UN Women, and especially looking at the CEDAW, the Convention to Eliminate Discrimination Against Women. And because we wanted to make sure that we can put on those issues on the table, and we bring policy issues that we can contribute to policy, and we can be able to also be involved. It's very important that we get involved in decision making and looking at those policies that our governments make. Unfortunately, and you may all agree with me that policies are there. They have already been written. They are there, but they don't involve Indigenous women. They don't involve the public a lot as much as it's needed, so that we can be able to contribute and be able to really make sure that we input some of the issues that are critical to us. And when it comes to the implementation, that is another disaster that we have among ourselves and among many governments. And these are some of the issues that we need to really look at them during this discussion, and look at these policies that are already there. If you look at issues of environment, if you look at the what you mentioned earlier on about the post-2020, yes, the discussion is there. The gender platform is being discussed on the post-2020. But when you look at the issue of the rights of Indigenous peoples, the rights of those women, is still something that needs to be looked at. We are looking and talking about targets and different issues, but we still have to emphasize so that the governments can be able to look at that and see women are the caretakers. They're the ones who have been protecting, conserving that biodiversity. And we really need to look at gender issues very critically. And when we look at climate change, we still also have a lot to discuss. Issues of desertification, issues of drought that impact on different Indigenous communities and also the public in general, because in Africa and some of the areas in Latin America and Asia are also impacted by drought. So I'm looking at those Rio conventions and seeing that we really we need to look at gender issues very critically. And as we go to discuss the post-20, if we don't discuss on the issues of gender and really make sure that the discussion that is already there on the table on looking at different targets include and really become friendly to gender issues, then we might be not going to achieve most of the issues that we are looking forward to in the next 2050, living in harmony with nature. Because when we look at holistically and the human rights approach, we really need to look at issues holistically, the way we can get people involved, people contributing, not leaving people aside, but they must contribute effectively and be able to participate. Let's not leave anyone behind in terms of participation. Include everyone, even the children, all the way to the processes. We are talking about girls, we are talking about women, and we are talking about the youth that we have. So it's very, very important to look at these critical issues together. And the most important thing is that for the Indigenous women, we also presented a resolution, a UN recommendation 39, to be able to be looked at it, and we had all to put all those issues in place and even talk about the human rights defenders, which he mentioned, because we know that for Indigenous women, they are more impacted than any others. They have no voice because of the traditions that we are in. They shy off. And the Indigenous world that we live in, a woman is always looked to be in the private. So we want to make sure that we open and get them out of the box and be able to see that issues can be out in there to be listened and to be able to see what impact can happen. We cannot work alone. We must work as a team. We must work collectively together. That's the only way we can be able to push our issues forward. The only way we can be able to push our governments to really take action by using and by having partners that can be able to work with us and to be able to bring issues. And today, this particular webinar is one of the areas that we believe if we are these recommendations are taken, then we can be able to really move forward. We are also talking about issues of funding, that we really need to make sure we have funding to reach out, and let it be also a strategy that can be able to reach out to the grassroots, to reach out to the rural women, because if you don't reach there, if you don't implement these recommendations, gender-based violence will never end. And gender violence, as I said, is impacting us in different ways, not only in the traditional ways where people think that these are the areas only impacted by women, by Indigenous women. They are really, a lot. Environmental issues are there, human rights issues are there, and also we need to really look at it holistically and using the human rights approach in order to be able to reach our goals and to be able to achieve what we are looking for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucy, for pointing out all these critical aspects of having an integrated and holistic approach. I'll come back to you with further questions. But now I'll move to, as a part of this collaboration and integrated approach, Gillian, you've been now with USAID and overseeing climate change, and we all know that climate resilience and other again requires a holistic approach and integrated implementation on ground also. So thank you for being with us today. And USAID is key leader, in addressing GBV in environmental sector. And can you tell us how USAID got more engaged in this issue and your approach to investing in solutions to solve this nexus? And how is USAID and the US government using its policy framework, including your upcoming climate strategy to establish addressing GBV as a priority in its climate response. So over to you, Gillian.
Thank you so much for having me, and we're really pleased to be co-sponsoring this webinar with IUCN, and so appreciate the comments of the women who came before me. Maybe I'll start with your second question first, which really relates to why this is a priority for USAID and how it's reflected in our policy frameworks. As you may or may not know, first of all, the US, under Biden's leadership, adopted a national strategy on gender equity and equality, which was really a call to action. Biden has been, I think, very progressive and put forward on both women's issues and on diversity, equity, and inclusion more broadly. And in our new climate strategy at USAID, which will take us through 2030, equity is a core principle, and women are specifically called out as leaders in whom we must invest in order to ensure an effective response to the climate crisis. This isn't a sort of a niche concern. We see this as central to our ability to succeed, that we engage over half the population in our efforts, and that we recognize how critical women are to the success of these efforts, given the fact that they are on the front lines and often have the most immediate access and understanding to climate impacts and to the solutions. But in terms of your first question regarding how we got more engaged in the issue, IUCN and our partnership has played an important role. Back in 2014, we partnered with IUCN to create Agent, which is an initiative standing for Advancing Gender in the Environment. And in that context, we commissioned IUCN to do a study to understand the correlation between environmental threats and gender-based violence, such as sexual violence, domestic violence, and forced prostitution. And not surprisingly, as many people have alluded to, that study did document close correlation. We know that the climate crisis is increasing gender-based violence, and that if we aren't specifically attending to those issues in the context of the design of our solutions, we may inadvertently also continue to perpetuate that kind of violence. So in response to that study and that understanding, we launched RISE, which stands for a Resilient, Inclusive, Sustainable Environments Challenge. And we're about to go through a new invitation for funding under that grants program. We've already awarded 9 grants with activities in Colombia and the DRC, Fiji, Guatemala, Kenya, Peru, Uganda, and Vietnam. And one of the things I want to emphasize is that USAID is really prioritizing more investment in locally based organizations. Historically, many of you may be aware that most of our investments have been in much larger international organizations like IUCN, who do critically important work. But we also recognize the importance of investing in the grassroots, and that is a core challenge and call to action from our administrator. So we would very much encourage potential partners on the call, not just international organizations, but also local practitioners to consider applying for support via RISE. And we've launched a new website called workingwithusaid.org, which is an effort to demystify the challenges of getting government funding, because we recognize that that can be difficult for smaller organizations. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Gillian. Again, I'll come back after the first round with some more questions. Now, from the global and regional perspective, let's go to a national level, some sharing of experiences and knowledge. So Andrea Cruz, again, you with Mexico, and Mexico stands apart as a leader in developing and agreeing policy, frameworks that include gender environment linkages. For example, Mexico is one of the few countries that have developed a gender responsive national biodiversity strategy and action plan, and has been active in the recent discussions to update and enhance the post 2020 gender plan of action under the CBD. Why are these so important for Mexico? If you can share why you became a leader and champion in taking it forward, and what opportunities does an ambitious updated CBD gender plan of action offers, especially with regards to the objective of addressing gender-based violence in relation to natural resources and key to advance gender equality and environmental sustainability alike. So Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, and I'm very glad to participate today. Very glad for the invitation. Well, I think that this is an issue very important for Mexico government and institutions, because we recognize that there is an historical debt to women and girls, and especially indigenous women and girls in rural environments, that includes limited access to land and natural resources, but also to education and health. So we see that the only way to achieve a more participatory and equal society would be to tackle these gender gaps and inequalities, especially in the environment-related issue. Biodiversity has been very close to the Mexican women, in particular in rural environments, and they have, as my previous colleagues have said, a very important role as caretakers and agents of change for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. It is not new that if resources are scarce or in crisis, as we have all witnessed during the COVID pandemic, violence will increase, and the ones that suffer the most this violence are, of course, women and girls. So if we want to end this violence and achieve sustainability, we have to work very close from a holistic point of view, taking into account these gender considerations. And we are very glad that we and very fortunate to have Iucn accompanying us during the update of our national biodiversity strategy. We were almost done with the document, and they came and told us if we wanted to conduct this gender mainstreaming perspective in the NBSAP, and we at first doubt, because we have very little time to do it, but we decided to do it, and we are very glad because it's been real learning experience for us. And now once we did it in the national level, we are also doing it in the subnational level. I coordinate the national subnational biodiversity strategies, and we have so far at least another 4 subnational strategies that are introducing the gender perspective in their lines of actions. So we are also doing or having a step forward to have this issue also in the subnational level, because that is, at national level you put merely the guidelines, but it's at the subnational levels and the more local levels where you really take action. So we think that is very important for us. I will stop my comment here, and I will come back later. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Yes, it's so critical that many a time we stop at having right policies and all this at the national level, but grassroots level, that's critical that those get implemented, and then evidence from the field then inform the national policy. So national, subnational, grassroots is a very critical element. And that's also good when Gillian also suggested that working with the grassroots, and they would also have access to resources. So it's good to see that we are all learning and then see how best to make this accessible to grassroots level organizations. Now let's move to back to Africa. And Uganda is also a country, where working with Spotlight Initiative uh, to, end violence against women and girls, including through community social norms change, establishing a gender-responsive judicial system, engaging with cultural leaders, and providing knowledge and data and real-time data analysis. So, Christine, I'll come to you. How can the work Uganda is doing to inform to be adapted to environmental programming on gender related? And what are some enabling factors to take into consideration at the policy and programming level? So if you can share some of your experiences from Uganda. So Christine?
Thank you very much, moderator. I think the same methodology currently being used under Spotlight Initiative can easily be adopted to the environmental programming. This is because environmental degradations results from communal practices and social beliefs handed from generation to generation. Hence, the custodians of these practices can be empowered to appreciate the effects and consequences of some of our practices on the environment and taught possible mitigation measures and new practices. Traditional leaders can also come up with pronouncements like we do in prevention of gender-based violence on the negative environmental degradations practices. These pronouncements can be disseminated to the community, and they can be able to use that. It can make them realize the importance of protecting our environment. We need to have also the multi-sectoral coordination mechanism, bringing in the judiciary on board to understand the repercussion of environmental degradation will make them more responsive and support ending impunity towards environmental degradation. Uganda can also develop regulations and enact more laws based on the real-time data analysis that can help us identify gaps and areas for policy formulation through viewing and listening in to the people's attitudes, opinions, and perspectives on environmental issues. We have quite a number of enabling factors that can help us in this. One is that we have the political will of our government. This is seen through their efforts to establish legal and policy framework. Looking at the Ugandan Vision 2040, expects to attain a green and clean environment with no water and pollution while conserving the flora and fauna and restoring and adding value to the ecosystem in the course of transforming Ugandan society from a peasant to a modern and prosperous country within 30 years. This is our vision, and I believe this is one of the enabling factors. We have the existence of our policies and laws. For example, the National Environmental Policy 1994, the Environmental Act Cap 133, the Forestry Policy 2010, the energy policy for Uganda 22, and then the National Forestry and Planting Act of 23. And these can help enabling factors that can help address that. Then the existence of the National Environmental Management Authority. That authority is responsible for for the management, and it's a structure that is right up to the lowest level of government. That is at parish and village level. They have committees that look at environmental issues, and majority part of women are part of those committees at that level. Then the establishment of Ministry of Waters and Environment is also very key, because with a ministry which is there, it provides an enabling environment for response to gender-based violence and also prevention of of environmental degradation. We have a hotline that is used to settle issues related to environmental degradations, which I believe can be very of assistance, especially if we want to intensify advocacy on issues of environment. Then the employment of environmental officers and forest officers at district level, that has also helped us, and I believe it can strengthen, and it's also an enabling environment that can help us address issues of environment in our community. Thank you very much. I'll come back later after when called for. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine, for sharing your experiences in Uganda. And Erin, I'll come to you now. Spotlight Initiative, as we have many, in our audience, environment-focused, members who are listening to it, but they might not be familiar with Spotlight Initiative. Can I invite you to start by sharing with us an overview of what you do, why Spotlight is so unique, and how are you starting to ensure that addressing biodiversity and climate crises, and they're woven in the fabric of what Spotlight Initiative is all about? How does it critically drive the programming of? Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's a real honor to be here. Thanks so much for inviting the Spotlight Initiative to be a partnership on this incredibly important panel, and deep gratitude to following Andrea and Christine from two of our most prominent Spotlight countries. It's great to follow in your footsteps to speak to you today. The Spotlight Initiative is the world's largest targeted effort to end all forms of violence against women and girls. We were launched with a seed funding commitment from the European Union of 500 million euros, representing an unprecedented global effort to invest in gender equality as a precondition and driver for the achievement of all Sustainable Development Goals. The initiative is currently implemented in 26 countries across 5 regions. So why are we so unique? I'm going to focus on 3 key ingredients. First, we are a flagship interagency program of the UN Secretary General and a demonstration fund for the UN Development System reforms. Concretely, this means that we offer more cohesive and integrated programming at country level, while ensuring collective responsibility of all actors to deliver on their commitments and make the broader UN system more efficient, adaptable, and better aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. Second, the Spotlight Initiative adopts a whole of society or 360 approach to tackle violence against women and girls. Our comprehensive theory of change harnesses what works with and a myriad of context-based promising practices to end gender-based violence while leveraging the synergies of interdependent interventions. In other words, the initiative is addressing legislative and policy gaps, strengthening institutions, promoting gender equitable attitudes, and providing quality services for survivors. Interventions are also strengthening systems for collecting data on violence against women and girls and building autonomous women's movements. Finally, our work is rooted in the evidence base that the leadership and engagement of civil society, and especially women's rights organizations and autonomous movements, is at the core of transformative and sustainable social change. The COVID-19 pandemic highlighted the importance of locally driven solutions and the vital role civil society can play in ensuring the voices of marginalized women are heard and included. That's why women's rights and feminist activists and movements are central and paramount partners in our work. They are the backbone of the Spotlight Initiative. Civil society is represented at every phase of Spotlight Initiative programming, from design and implementation to monitoring, decision-making, and governance. And they have a critical role in holding the initiative accountable to its commitments. Now, on to the second part of your question. When it comes to the climate and biodiversity crisis, we are well aware of the tragic reality that the impact of climate change is not neutral. It disproportionately impacts women, girls, and most marginalized groups. We are seeing this up close in several of our programs. Indeed, several Spotlight Initiative programs have faced climate-related disasters in the past years, which affected implementation, These have included tropical cyclone in Vanuatu, another cyclone in Mozambique, devastating floods across Malawi, Uganda, Honduras, and elsewhere. So as part of our comprehensive approach, the Spotlight Initiative is able to address the interconnections of violence against women and girls and climate-related disasters by strengthening women's rights organizations and protecting women and girls' fundamental human rights. The initiative also contributes to reinforcing the resilience needed to face the threats of climate change. I'll give you a couple of quick examples. In Vanuatu, the Spotlight Initiative has worked to ensure that violence against women and girls is systematically addressed following weather-related disasters in collaboration with the Ministry of Climate Change Adaptation by strengthening institutional capacities to integrate and institutionalize violence against women and girls prevention and response. The initiative has actively engaged with the subcluster on GBV and emergencies, laying the foundations for coordinated prevention and response efforts in the future. In Uganda, the initiative supported the provision of sexual and reproductive health services in refugee, border, and flood-affected districts, and enabled women's civil society organizations to combine resources across programs on violence against women and girls to respond to the unique needs and abuse of vulnerable groups. An intersectional analysis was employed to ensure no one was left behind. And in the future, these groups will be integrated into intervention design to ensure the sustainability of service delivery. But this is really just the start of our journey to better understand and address the inherent and empirical interlinkages between climate change and gender-based violence. Our mandate of leaving no one behind is at stake, and addressing the rapidly changing climate and its devastating gendered impact is a matter of justice for the rights holders we aim to serve. We are deeply committed to strengthening our response to this nexus, to keep learning from others in this field of work, and to position the initiative as a bridge between the field of climate change and biodiversity and ending violence against women and girls. We are honored to kickstart our partnership with Iucn under its GBV Environment Center for CSW 66, where we will highlight GBV and climate change links and elevate the voices of first-hand impacted civil society partners. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. You rightly said climate change, impacts are not neutral. They impact differently depending on the coping mechanism. And it's great to see in many countries it's being realized, and women are not just victim, they are also agent of change, and that is happening very well in donors policies also. So Gillian, I'll come back to you on this point. It's great to see the whole US coming back into the Paris Agreement, and with all the regenerated energy and everything, now taking a leadership role in response to climate change. So how, the national level, all the thing, you integrating climate and gender and all this. So climate strategy, how is going to inform other international decision-making processes, including CSW in the coming week, and the Paris Agreement overall, which is so critical to have an integrated approach there. So over to you, Gillian.
Yeah, it is good to be back in action on climate change here in the United States. I was at the COP in Glasgow, of course, and the US government was out in force, and that was noted by many country and NGO participants after a very regrettable absence. So, part of the reason that I decided to move into government, which hadn't been my history. I mean, historically, I've worked with NGOs globally, was because the U.S. has this outsized potential to influence global debates, outsized resources and influence diplomatically. And I think we have an enormous role to play in advancing gender equity more broadly, and in the context of climate action. One such example is the UNFCCC submissions to document progress towards the Gender Action Plan. And that'll be an important opportunity for the US to highlight ways in which we're working on gender equality and gender-based violence, to highlight, the evidence and practices that, we've advanced. I think that we'd also encourage members of the international development community more broadly to leverage opportunities like we've done with Iucn to make commitments towards gender responsive climate action during the UN Women's Generation Equality. I think, we just need to be speaking out very clearly as the US government in all of the fora possible, and not considering the issues that women face as ones to be considered separately from the central challenges facing the world today. The more we can mainstream a conversation about gender equity and the importance of women in leadership at all levels on all issues, the better off we'll be. And of course, that's coming very clearly to mind as we watch yet another horrible and violent invasion in Ukraine, which is just absolutely devastating, and I'm sure devastating first and foremost for women who tend to face the strongest consequences where war is involved.
Thank you, Gillian. And to our audience also, thank you for putting all these questions. I'll come to those very, after having a very quick round with our speakers. And so please keep sending your questions. Andrea, as Mexico is taking lead in integrating gender into different sectors, so what steps Mexico can take in its next update of NBSAP to reflect just GBV? What are your plans?
Well, I think that what Mexico institutions are planning is to conduct a very quick review of our actual NBSAP just to align to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, and to develop Mexican targets that will be the commitments to put forward to the CBD as a Mexican contribution. And with that, I think that well, we already have the gender perspective in the core of our NBSAP, so it would be to have a more focus on the implementation and to achieving the activities that we are conducting, and to have I think a challenge is to report. Reporting would be a challenge, especially if we want to have gender disaggregated data. We already tried to do that during the elaboration of the 6th national report, and it was a challenge because not all the institutions and all the people have these data disaggregated. So still there is some things that we have to continue working on, having awareness to the institutions and the peoples that conduct the activities to have, record the data in a way that we can report it in a disaggregated way, because if you don't know how to measure things, then you don't know how to assess the impact of it. So it would be very important to have this also. Thank you,
Andrea, for pointing it out here. Data-driven policies and implementation to assess progress. That's a major challenge in many parts of the world, including organizations not having baseline data, and then to assess progress, and then to also take forward the international discourses, which is based on data-driven and science. So that, again, we are all trying to work together in this, but still a lot needs to be done. Coming back to you, Christine, what are your hopes of CSW negotiations and outcome? At Uganda Ministry also you work very closely. So how can they support Uganda's effort in prevention and responses to gender-based violence. Just a quick, your thoughts on this.
Thank you very much. Uganda hopes that CSW shall provide an opportunity and space to share experience and best practices on its implementation of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs, as well as participate in an interactive sessions that advance women's equality, gender equality through an integral approach. We also know that CSW remains instrumental in promoting the women's rights and documenting the reality of women's lives across all levels and shaping standards and gender equality and the empowerment of women. In regards to supporting women's Uganda's efforts, the country has fulfilled its international obligation with regard to gender equality and reduction of national emissions and adapting to the impacts of climate change by allocating the necessary resources to implement the partnership plan. Women and girls play a critical role in climate change adaptation and mitigation through their roles in the key sectors such as agriculture or through sustainable management of natural resources and conservation of ecosystems, including those with important carbon restoration functions and such as in the forestry. It's very important that they are brought on board in decision making in relations to gender-based violence and climate change, which has a diverse effect on their livelihood. And until women are brought on board in the decision making at all levels, then it will be very difficult to have sustainable development and also have reduction and of degradation of our environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christine. Coming to you, Lucy, you shared about the work you've been doing and all this. And according to you, very quickly, what do you think are the most pressing, emerging policies or frameworks which are working, and what are the gaps?
Thank you very much, Ali. I think most of them they have spoken quite interesting, and I think I support what Christine has just spoken about policies in Uganda, which also impact in different countries. The policies are there, Ali, and the policies have been put in place. I think the most challenging thing for all of us, and especially for the rural and indigenous women, is the question of really understanding those policies. And when Andrea Cruz was explaining about the NB subs, this was a process which was also undertaken a lot to make sure that at least issues of the convention and regulations that had already been done at the discussion at different level, at the national, international level, could come back to the national level and be integrated and be, domesticated into the national environment programs. But unfortunately, when it comes to the participation, again, this is where, again, I bring the issue of participation. It's very crucial that we really make sure that we really involve all the public to be able to understand, and especially those who are really totally involved, as we had mentioned earlier on, women, indigenous women, and also those rural women. The policies can be very effective if only they are contributed, there is that openness in terms of participatory approaches that can be done in place so that they can be able to be involving everyone. One of the other things that we as indigenous people have been doing now in terms of looking at different aspects is to really work with young women, young indigenous ladies, and we have been undertaking different programs. Right now we have also launched where we have them trained on research methodologies, so that they can be able to collect that data that we are saying and the disaggregation of data together so that we can be able to work. And also they can help down at the level to look at and help even indigenous women down at the country level, at the rural level, to collect some of this data together. We have also been working with young women to look at issues of climate change, to collect data and to be able to interview and look at the impact of Indigenous women and climate change, and look at issues of how we are losing biodiversity, what can be done. Is the traditional knowledge still there? And there are quite some challenges that have come up also on issues of language, traditional knowledge being lost, and we needed to bring it back. The issue of having the traditional institutions put in place so that this institution can also be able to help in terms of looking at issues of biodiversity, climate change, and the Rio Convention on Drought, and be able to bring together the people to be open and to be able to discuss differently. And I'm really excited to hear all these other programs that are happening in different places, and it would be really glad that the Indigenous peoples and Indigenous women are also involved, and Indigenous girls at the ground level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. My last question before going into audience questions, Erin, Lucy just mentioned, policies are there, the implementation, participation which is, more challenging. So Spotlight, working in different countries and globally. So what the work you are doing, how, these to enable policy frameworks and how to involve policymakers and inform them about these challenges, about the implementation processes, how to enable these policy implementation processes.
Great, thanks so much for the question, and thanks to the other panelists for all your amazing insights. What we know is that we don't work in a vacuum, right? We need the entire ecosystem to be engaged for effective policy change that complements and supports effective implementation. The first pillar of Spotlight Initiative's theory of change relates to policies and legislations to eliminate violence against women and girls. And under this pillar, we focus on developing and strengthening policies and legislation and establishing and strengthening existing mechanisms to support implementation, including through development of national and subnational action plans, as well as to kind of promote the alignment with international standards. One of the greatest success stories of 2020, we're still processing our 2021 data, was that we saw that in 17 countries, 84 laws and policies were signed or strengthened with our support to address violence against women and girls or improve gender equality and support women's rights. All frameworks to address GBV are context specific, and there's no uniform set of enabling policy frameworks. But that said, from all of our programs, there are a few recipes for success, a few ingredients that we can kind of pull out to say this is really important. One of these is strengthening and enhancing the capacities of parliamentarians in legislative drafting, analysis, and policymaking to ensure that laws and policies are survivor-centered and are inclusive of marginalized groups. Expanding the knowledge on GBV of environmental policymakers is critical for increased and specific attention to addressing GBV as a fundamental gender gap in environmental issues and beyond. Also, systematically engaging a wide range of stakeholders, including survivors and marginalized groups, to ensure that a plurality of perspectives are taken on board, from the initial legal assessments to the monitoring of the laws. And I'll just give a quick example. In Grenada, a national victims' rights policy is being drafted by civil society organizations in consultations with survivors to ensure high-quality services are survivor-centered, timely, accessible, and of high quality. This is a great example for environmental policymakers to not only adequately address gender and environment linkages, but also to ensure that the laws and policies are sustainable and rights-based. And we had a quick note on this earlier, but given that customary or religious laws regularly practiced through informal courts provide the main avenue to address violence against women in many countries, we found that partnering with religious and traditional leaders to ensure the mainstreaming of a gender-responsive approach in laws and policies addressing violence against women and girls has been a critical enabling factor to change deeply held cultural beliefs and practices. I'll reinforce, because it's so important, that we need to center women and environmental rights defenders and women's rights organizations in legal and policy making. ensuring that they are recognized, supported, and enabled to participate equally meaningfully and powerfully in the promotion and protection of human rights. In 2020, we saw that 21 laws and policies were developed to guarantee the ability of women's rights groups, civil society organizations, and human rights defenders to advance the human rights agenda. The importance of engaging the community and local partner organizations, especially women's rights organizations that are at the forefront of gender justice work, cannot be overstated. And finally, in the spirit of leaving no one behind, sensitizing the public on legislative frameworks, including by presenting policies in an easy to understand way, raising awareness and translating laws and policies into local languages is paramount to ensure widespread knowledge of legal frameworks. For example, in Nigeria, the program contributed to the translation of the Violence Against Persons Prohibition into 4 local languages and promoted its dissemination. This has resulted in improved knowledge among various communities, including people living with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. I'm looking at the questions, and some of them have been, already addressed, and some, alluded to. So again, just coming back, it's important, it's asked, and it's told, what can be done to link gender and climate change initiative in countries where policy does not yet reflect understanding of the connection? So just thoughts. So very quickly, your take on this, the countries who still don't see somehow the connection, because as is rightly been alluded here, we cannot operate in vacuum, and especially climate change is whatever is happening around us, because your and mine and everyone's resilience is not just connected to one aspect. It's also ecosystems or nature, it's also health, it's also education, security, everything. And especially this gender and climate change we have seen in many countries. I have first-hand experience work looking into projects from Cambodia to Uganda to Peru, elsewhere, where women-led initiative, they are more successful, especially in rural setting. But many a time countries at the national policy level don't see that link. So maybe starting with Gillian, you, because you are at that where you are supporting countries, can donors play that role to help them see the link, especially now in the new setting where you are having gender and your aid also linked?
I think donors can play a very important role. And at the same time, I think we want to avoid a scenario where the dollars are driving the directives. Because what we want is a real long-term investment from governments. And there's always a worry, for any donor that, strategies that aren't grounded in kind of the lived reality and committed focus of the NGO community, for example, may attract proposals for support, but won't really kind of outlive the initiative itself. So, I think USAID is in this unique position because we've been around for more than 60 years. We have an on-the-ground presence in 100 countries worldwide. We have missions in 80 countries. And we have, sort of the long view in terms of what's going on with that country and its evolution, and a broad range of relationships with public actors, with NGOs, and with key leaders in government. And sometimes it takes time to build the kinds of commitment that we're looking for, not just with respect to gender and addressing gender-based violence, but even with something as fundamental as a transition to renewable energy economy. You need an infrastructure, and you need financial and technical support to make that possible. And for many countries in which we work, the fossil fuel infrastructure is sort of the default option. And of course, many are still coal dependent. So I think, yes, donors can play a very important role in helping drive the conversation and direct and move things in the right direction, but not without the real and genuine partnership of the governments and NGOs that we're working with. And I think donors need to be listening and learning as well as you know, as directing things and speaking.
Thank you, Gillian, for highlighting this important point that, you know, donor-driven things, they need to be, you know, further integrated with ownership at the national level. Andrea, what's your take on it, being at the national helm of the policies and all this? How you see what, you know, you shared that Mexico response is quite well integrated, but what could be done? Okay, you know, what did work in your case, okay, where you were able to see the link and integrated it?
Well, first, I think it really worked that Mexico has good institutions that are specialized in gender issues. We have the In Mujeres, which is a specialized agency from the government that tries to mainstream the gender perspective in all the areas of the federal government. And also, in our case, well, it really was a fortune that Iucn approached to us and offer us this opportunity to work with this. They already have the opportunity to do the Red Plus strategy in Mexico with the gender perspective. So there already was an experience. And I think that now that we have the experience and that we have, you know, the chip in our brains, it's easier to see the importance of continue working in these issues. And I think that there is more awareness. Still, we have some institutional arrangements, but I think they are in place. They have to be reinforced. But now it's almost like we cannot think on doing the update of our NBSAP if we are not going to take into account the gender issue and the relations to the violence. So I think it's just, it takes a light, a small light even, to people to start learning and then to build some capacities that fortunately there are so many initiatives now, and the topic is in the center of many discussions that I think it's not going to be forgiven or forgotten. We have to continue working on that, but I think it's already there. Is not going to go anywhere else. It's going to stay.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll come to others also, but as we have many questions, so let me go to another question. It's that conservation workers, you know, working with indigenous and local communities globally, often hear disclosure of violence from women with whom they are working, but lack the knowledge of what resources are available to assist them. How can staff working locally access resources for women and girls facing violence in their communities due to their work to protect their environment? So maybe Lucy, your take on it? Lucy, are you there? Okay, so till this Lucy joins again. Christine, about the resources and linking them with local women.
I believe that there are resources within our community that we can link the various survivors to within the community. You know, many times people look at the available they look at available human resource that are within the community, but they don't take them seriously, and yet they can provide, you know, access to a number of things like access to justice, access to health services, and so many other things. The only thing that we need is how do we coordinate the resources that we have within our community to effectively respond to any of the issues that we have in the environment that we live in. Many times we ignore the very resources that we have, the human capital that we have, and then the structures that are within, and try to create our own structures, which at the end of it all is not sustainable. So it's very important that we actually look at the available resources and make use of that, like the health facilities, the local offices that exist within the locality. Thank you.
Okay, right. Erin, very quickly, there's a question that how does the Spotlight Initiative ensure the equal inclusion of Indigenous women? So very quickly, you have mentioned, but again, just.
Great. I mean, it relates a bit to your last question, right? So much of this is about how we plan our interventions and the work that we do in advance of implementation to ensure that we are effectively engaging and considering all of the potential risks we may encounter when we're engaging in this work. So for the Spotlight Initiative, from the onset, we prioritized the engagement of Indigenous women, and we took this really seriously. So we didn't cut corners in the planning stage. We made sure that we were asking the right questions at the right time to the right people, and then going even deeper and really kind of trying to interrogate the shortcomings of previous interventions in effectively engaging women. Why weren't they engaging? What were the barriers to engagement? What could we do to already address barriers in the planning phase that could help with engagement throughout implementation? So really careful planning, really upfront commitment to considering engagement of marginalized groups.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Sorry, we are coming to an end, and there are many questions, but we will try to answer. But just 30-second take-home message from our panelists. But before that, together, I'll start with you, Gillian. But there is a very specific question: is RISE able to fund international organizations, or only able to directly fund local organizations? Together with your 30-second take-home, Gillian.
Yes, we can fund international and local organizations. I was just emphasizing our focus on localization and increasing our support for local and national organizations in the years to come. I mean, it's day one of International Women's Month, right? So here we are again doing what we should be doing all the time. Sometimes it's frustrating to continue to have this conversation. And yet, as was alluded to at the beginning, COVID really set us back on a lot of levels because women bear the brunt of the economic and home burden combination. So we're seeing many of the already existing disparities increase. We've got to double down and get past this so we can really get to some much deeper issues at a systemic level in order to tackle the climate crisis. But I long for a day when it won't be necessary to continue to have this particular conversation.
Thank you, Gillian. Andrea, last 30-second take-home message.
Well, just very glad to be here. And as Gillian said, I think COVID set us back a little bit, but don't lose hope. We're still here working every day, and we have to work for the girls that are around us that deserve a better world, and also for the boys. They deserve to have nice partners and intelligent and forceful partners for a better world, and this is the only way to do it. So I am glad we started with International Women's Day, and now we are going for a month. So I think soon it's going to be the whole year, and then we won't have to make it just so visible. But now we have to keep it visible for this. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we need maybe a decade of whole just women focus. Christine, last take home message, please.
Thank you very much. My last message is that we still have a lot of work to do. Our community needs all the support they can get. They have all the ideas, no, they have all the abilities. The only thing is that they need to be enlightened on what they can possibly do within their means. So my appeal to everyone is that let's utilize the very community that we have to be able to solve many of the problems that they have within them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Erin, last words.
Great, thanks so much. So we're at an inflection point now. There is simply no more time to waste, and there is no more time for excuses. Policymakers no longer can say, we didn't know that there was an intersection between violence and climate change. The evidence is there. It is time for action. Donors need to really emphasize this in all of their programming. There should be no funding going into gender-based violence that doesn't consider climate change. There should be no funding going to climate-related interventions that doesn't consider gender issues. It is the time is now, and I want to support Christine. The women on the ground know this is happening. Let's elevate their voices. Let's make sure they are the ones telling us what's needed and make sure that they have the platform required. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, the panelists and audience. Sorry, we are 1 minute late, but do visit Iucn website, which has all the information which you can take forward and approach us and contact us. And we look forward working with you all. Thanks again, and goodbye for now.
Thank you.